All right, here we are with another episode of Coffee with the Founder. Got my coffee cup here, my drink inside, and of course we have another great guest, Doc. Good to have you with us. Listen, we're doing these coffee talks as a way to introduce people to the WPC network, the WPC family, to learn more about what people do, because a lot of times people see us at conferences, but they don't really get to know about the work we do, how we came to do the work, but also the work we do long after we leave the conference. So that's what we want to do. Let's get started right away just by asking you, can you introduce yourself and tell people what it is that you do?
Yes. Good afternoon to all the WPC family. My name is Dr. Khalid el-Hakim. I'm the founder and curator of the Black History 101 Mobile Museum, and just recently founded the Michigan Hip Hop Archive, which is on the campus of Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan.
Now, those are two possibly related topics, mobile museum and hip hop archives, but let's start with the museum because that's really how we got connected. Give us a sense of how that happens, how someone creates or goes about creating a mobile museum and what that looks like.
Well, initially it came as a result of me just trying to understand who I am as a Black man in America, going through a K through 12 system that did not teach the history of Black people in a very profound or relevant way to me. As a student at Ferris State University, I took a sociology class with a professor by the name of Dr. David Pilgrim, which many of your people at WPC might be familiar with his work. He's the founder of the Jim Crow Museum of Racist Memorabilia. And he had a very powerful and unique way of teaching about the origins of racism and the impact of racism in America. And he used to bring in a different artifact, Jim Crow related artifact every week, and have us engage in dialogue about the origins of race in America. So it was through his class initially that I started collecting Jim Crow related material. Shortly after taking this class, I started going through antique shops and used bookstores and garage sales and flea markets up in northern Michigan, finding material that depicted African Americans in very stereotypical type of ways. But you find these negative depictions of Black people in all types of products throughout the history of America. So whether or not it's a postcard or a children's book or representations in textbooks or photographs or products, you find these negative depictions. And some of those images are still with us today in the form of, say like Aunt Jemima, for example. So that is my initial introduction to the Jim Crow era. But a backdrop to that is, this is in the late 80s, early 90s, my exposure to hip hop culture and participating in hip hop culture and learning about Black history via hip hop culture. So it was groups like KRS-One's Boogie Down Productions, who had a very powerful album cover back in '87 that he recreated the iconic photograph of Malcolm X standing at the window holding a gun. And when he recreated that and put that on his album cover, a whole generation of us inquired about the history of Malcolm X. And people forget that during that time era, Malcolm X was not a very popular iconic figure. It was hip hop that raised his visibility when the school districts were not teaching him in the curriculum at all. So it was hip hop that had Malcolm X become popular, whether or not it was the Malcolm X hats or eventually Malcolm X, the movie that came out via Spike Lee. But a whole generation of us were reading the autobiography of Malcolm X, and not because of our experience in K through 12 schools, right? So so that's the backdrop of me going into Dr. Pilgrim's class, and us knowing that, you grow up in America as a Black man, you know that racism exists. You might not be able to articulate it. You might not be able to actually put a finger on exactly what's going on. But when you have that historical context and you're able to make those connections, it's a transforming thing. And it was that got me really into collecting and seeing the power of an artifact to be able to be used as a teaching tool in order to raise awareness about social injustice in America. So after taking this class, I started collecting. I ended up becoming a social studies teacher in the Detroit public schools, and I taught there for 15 years. And after I came back from the Million Man March in 1995, what once was a private collection became a public collection. I started doing public displays in about 95, 96. And from those public displays, when people saw the material that I had collected over those past 5 or so years, I started getting invitations to go to churches, to mosques, to synagogues, eventually to college campuses. And once I hit college campuses, it changed to a whole different league and field for me. And it just spread from there, man. And the response has been overwhelming for the past 15 or so years on a national level. In 2006, I started doing things on a national level. And the museum at this point has been to 40 states and over 500 institutions. And so it's not just colleges, but K through 12 schools, corporations, government agencies, libraries, museums. It's been some very, very diverse spaces. And overall, man, the response has been great.
Yeah. Well, so much I got coming from all of that. Of course, David Pilgrim being a family member, a friend of the WPC, because years ago we had the museum almost like what we call a exhibit within the conference. While people were attending, they could walk by and and see everything he was doing. So he was an early partner, and I mean, this is a prime example of. And you know this being a classroom teacher, you just never know who you're going to impact or how you're going to impact. So it's just really just a testimony to something far greater than us to have now you hopefully continuing to be a part of the WPC family. I wanted to ask you about the impact that the museum is having on white kids primarily, because I'm assuming, for us as whether youngsters or even as adults, coming to some realization, there's just a different kind of impact. But over your 25 plus years, 20 plus years of doing this and all the places you've done it, what have been, I mean, if I'm talking to a white educator, or a white teacher, or a white administrator saying you gotta have this museum at your school, what would be your reasons? What has been some of the impact you've seen this having on white students?
Yeah. So some of my biggest contracts in the public school arena have been through schools up in the Portland area, schools in the Columbia, Missouri area, and up in Wisconsin, in the Madison, city of Madison, that area as well. And the impact has been overwhelming. In naming these areas, these are school districts that I've had relationships with now, at least in Portland, for over 10 years now. I've been going out to school districts in Portland. And so for the middle school schools that I go to, in the spring semesters, when they start doing American history, 8th grade, and start talking about the Reconstruction era, and they kind of touch on Jim Crow, but slavery, civil rights, Civil War, Reconstruction is when they usually call me in during that time of year. And so hitting 8th graders and giving them that historical context and letting them see that this history is real. When you show a primary source document or object to students, one of the biggest responses I get is that this history is real. This history is real. I can't believe that I'm holding chains or shackles from slavery. I can't believe that in the midst or after slavery, or someone like a George Washington Carver who was born into slavery actually became a scientist, and not just a scientist, but one of the top scientists of his era. And we still benefit from his work. Also, and a lot of this work has to do with people understanding narratives and adding and disrupting narratives that people have been taught or things that people have not been exposed to before. And so we really have to push back with what has been taught. It's not just an education for the students either. It's an education for the teachers.
Yeah.
And because a lot of the teachers have been taught the same way that their elders taught them. And we're still hearing that same narrative in terms of Black history. We get a piece of Martin Luther King. We don't get all of Martin Luther King. We still get Martin Luther King through the lens of I Have a Dream. Yeah. We still are only getting Rosa Parks. We're barely getting any Malcolm at all. Yeah. But besides those three, I call them the Black Trinity, besides those three, a lot of people are not getting Black history in the K through 12 curriculums. And so the Black History 101 Mobile Museum is a way to introduce these historical iconic figures, to disrupt the curriculum that has been given to them, and to challenge the teachers to teach a little bit more, to dig a little bit deeper, and to go beyond the textbooks that have been given to them. I mean, we have textbooks in 2020 that are teaching that Africans who came over here as immigrants. You know what I'm saying? And we know that's not true, but they're teaching that. So we have to combat that. And one of the best ways to combat that is through evidence. It's through artifacts. It's through showing people ledgers from slave ships and how many people were packed in on those ships. It's also important. We're in the month of Ramadan right now as Muslims, and a lot of people need to understand that the first people to celebrate Ramadan on these shores were those Africans who were stolen from the continent. Mm-hmm. All right, and that's very important to put into the minds of the students that there's a long history of Islam in America. There's a long history of Black people making positive contributions to this nation in America. And we've had scientists, educators, and all. I mean, just think about all the different ways that we responded to racism in America in every field of endeavor. We have examples of that through these artifacts that we've collected and we exhibit around the country.
Yeah, I'm wondering, you got one opportunity to show one piece of artifact. What would you show? Is there one piece you would say that has taught me that if I had only a chance to show one thing that I've learned from, that has kind of moved me? I know it's hard, but I'm just wondering, like, what's been that piece over all these years that has kind of, jolted you, that you could never forget in that David Pilgrim experience, or even in your collection?
Yeah.
That you would, kind of always show because this is such an important message.
I would probably say the lynching photo from Marion, Indiana, 1930. And people, it's almost become an iconic photograph because it's two men that were lynched that day, and there was a third man who was supposed to be lynched, and he actually escaped. His name was James Cameron, and that photograph was also on the cover of a Public Enemy album, a 12-inch single that they put out called Hazy Shade of Criminal in 1991. When I first saw that album cover from Public Enemy, I initially wanted to know, was that a staged photograph? Because I had never seen anything like that before. And the only lynching I had heard of at that time in 1991 was Emmett Till. And when that album came out, it was kind of on the heels of the Rodney King beating as well. So we kind of knew that, yeah, if you grew up in the hood, that if you've had any experience with the police, that, a lynching could take place for sure. And we know that that's how some folks get down in terms of their interactions with black boys in particular, but it happens to Black women as well. But so we made a connection between that photograph and our experience as young people in America, and again, knowing Emmett Till's history, it just brought all that full circle. So I had the opportunity to actually purchase one of the original photographs of that lynching, which I did about 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. So I usually display that original photograph along with that Public Enemy album to show that connection between history and hip hop, and the power of hip hop to use its platform to educate the people, which Public Enemy did in an amazing way. And again, you have a culture that people like to dismiss, but forget that it was hip hop artists that raised the consciousness of their fan base, black and white, to look at historical injustice and then call into question the powers that be. So I think that picture for me kind of does it.
Yeah, thank you, Doc. We'll do what we can to get a link to that and to the museum as part of the interview, so people can have some direct reference to that. I was going to ask you about COVID-19 because my experience as a scholar, as an innovator, as an entrepreneur, that in times like these, we get to cooking, we get to thinking, we get to reflecting. And I'm wondering, as you've been doing all this work all these years and this pandemic hits and we've essentially had to shut down and kind of, chill out and reflect. I mean, what has this time told you about you? What is it that you've been thinking about when you think about all your work and now what's ahead of us, the challenges, the opportunities, so on and so forth?
Well, I got to share a new project that I've been working on. If I did not have this time to sit and reflect, this product would have never come out. But I was in Columbia, Missouri, the first 2 weeks of March. I was doing some work in the Columbia Public Schools, a 2-week project with them. And so during that process, we started to get the rumblings of, all right, this is going nationwide. And I was right at the end of one of my largest tours ever with the Black History 101 Mobile Museum. I actually had 3 different exhibits out on the road. I had 3 teams of us out on the road at the time. I had a group of us in the Northeast. We were in Columbia, and then I had a third group that was on the West Coast. And this was the first time in my career where I wasn't either teaching a class, working on my dissertation, or a part of something else that didn't allow me to do the museum full time. So this was a huge year for us with the museum, and it was going well until COVID hit, and then the cancellations started coming in, and we had to leave Columbia early. So I was back home in mid-March. So sitting home since mid-March, one of the things I've done over the past 20 years, somebody told me years ago through my travels that it was important for me to document my travels with a camera. So for the past 20 years, I've been going around the country and just taking pictures. And I found the way people responded to my photography, it's been a healing for people because I take pictures of landscapes and nature. And for myself, it's been therapeutic for me because people often ask me, how do you work so closely and so intimately with all this racist material? Like, why aren't you mad, or why aren't you angry, and those types of things, which I am. I'm in a constant state of anger, just like James Baldwin said to be a Black man in America is to be in a constant state of rage. But it's what we do with that rage, is how we challenge that anger, is what makes the difference, right? So I've been taking this time to reflect. At the beginning of Ramadan, I was reintroduced into the work of the 15th century poet Rumi. And I started reading Rumi's work. And as I read some of his quotes, I started getting images of my photography in my head. And I started posting photographs of my work curated with quotes from Rumi. And I've done that every day since the beginning of Ramadan on my Facebook page and on my IG, and the response has been overwhelming. So what I've decided to do is put these quotes and photography into a book. It's called Ruminations, and it's just quotes in photography of just reflecting and meditating, using the visual arts, using literature, using social studies, and looking at how we work through trauma, using these photos and these quotes to meditate and to be and use these activities as mindfulness to deal with some of the trauma and some of the questions that we've been forced to look at, and just try to look beyond or look deeper or look outside the box and understand that some of the things that we're going through are bigger than us, and that we are interconnected with other people, that the things that happen to someone over in India has a direct impact on us, or the things that we do here in America might have an impact on people, on the other side of the world. But that's what I've been thinking on. That's what I've been thinking about for this time I've had to reflect. So this book is my attempt to provide us a new way of looking at some of this trauma. So that's the big takeaway for me as we come out of this COVID, or at the point that we come out of this COVID situation. Also, with the Black History 101 Mobile Museum, in particular, looking at how this museum will look and envision how this museum will look in digital spaces such as this. How can I do workshops? How can I do virtual tours with the museum if I can't get on a plane and travel, 2,000 miles away from where I live in Michigan? So how do we work through these difficult times? So those are two of the big things I'm looking at right now.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You mentioned trauma. You mentioned the original photo from the lynching. You mentioned also Emmett Till, and I'm wondering, as some would argue, watch a lynching right before our eyes today, in the young brother that was killed in the streets on camera in Georgia. And the sister, which you mentioned also, we can't lose sight of, that there were also Black women, killed and tortured in these ways, but often those visuals aren't what we see a lot of, but we just, again, hear of an execution, essentially, of this young woman in Kentucky, Breonna Taylor. So I say all of that to ask you, what's your message to young kids of color today, bruh, as a way to really possibly speak to the trauma that they're witnessing, not just of the past, but right here today in our eyes? If you were talking to a group of high school kids, just really trying to help them to be processing the time from the time today as it relates to the time of yesterday, and thinking about the time of tomorrow.
Right. First and foremost, I love you. One of the most powerful things that you can tell Black children, Black teenagers, coming from a Black man, is that I honestly, sincerely love you. Right? And we have to be able to tell each other that. And we have to be able to, and it's not just one speech that you can tell a group of young folks. There has to be a process that young folks have to go through. And as adults, as educators, as activists, it's our duty to create those spaces for them. Because sometimes they don't know what they're going through. Like I said earlier, growing up as a Black man in America as a teenager, you kind of know that something's wrong, but you can't really put your finger on what that is. And if there's not adults around you who can put you up on game, then you miss out. You're floundering. So it's important for us to create spaces for young people, rites of passage programs work, or some type of mentoring program that works for young students. But I mean, initially for a group of young folks, find people that care about you. I'll ask them to question authority, question your teachers, ask questions, ask questions, ask questions.
Yeah.
And also let them know that they have power too. That you don't have to be quiet. That if you see something that's an injustice, that you can't speak out against it. And to let them know too that it's always been young people being active that has caused change in America.
Yeah.
Youth have always been at the forefront of change in America. So it's important for them to know the power that they have, that they don't have to just sit and be quiet.
Well, building off of that point, young people making noise, changing America, let's move to the hip hop archives.
Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit about how this project came about and what your goal is in creating the new archives there at the university?
Yes. So parallel to the Black History 101 Mobile Museum, parallel to my teaching career, I also was working in the hip hop industry as well. So I found out early on as an undergrad, when I was at Ferris State University, I was working on the student programming board. And so it was our responsibility to bring speakers to campus, comedians, hip hop artists, and other folks to campus. So I learned how to negotiate contracts and such as a student at Ferris. And I was also part of a poetry collective at school. And it was my job to book us shows around the Michigan area. So we played a lot of coffee houses and things like that. But our group, we were imitating, if you looked at us, we were obviously imitating the last poets. And so there was a sister in Detroit who saw us perform, and she saw what we were doing, and she's like, yo, I know the last poets, I'm going to introduce you to them. And I didn't believe her, but I got a phone call one day from Umar bin Hassan from the Last Poets. And he came up to see us perform, and he was really impressed with what we were doing. And I told him the work that I was doing in terms of booking shows. He was like, man, if you could book shows for you all, maybe you could book some shows for us. And I started doing that. This was 1994. And at that time, I had just met, Jessica Care Moore from Detroit, the poet.
Yes, yes.
Me and Jessica met the Last Poets on the same night. And so, and this was 1994. The Last Poets invited Jessica and I and our group to come out. And we know that when Jessica went, she went on Apollo from that point. She won Apollo 5 times. And it just, her career just took off from there.
Yeah.
But I started booking shows for the Last Poets in 94. And all the way up until today, this is their 51st anniversary of their album. Their very first album is on the 19th of May. But I've been booking shows for them for that many years, man, and they changed my life. But with that, being from Detroit, I ended up booking, being a manager for a group called 5 Elements. And the guy who started 5 Elements, his name was Proof. He was a part of a group called D12. And for folks who are familiar with the history of hip hop in Detroit, we know that Eminem is one of the largest, is the largest artist that came out of Detroit. But Proof was his best friend. And he was also a very good friend of mine. And I started working with Proof in 1998, right before Eminem blew up. But my relationship with him took me literally around the world. All right. So I worked with Proof up until the day he was murdered in 2006. All right. So my history with hip hop is going back real deep. So not only in terms of business, but also just as a participant of the culture, as a fan of the culture. And so I all the time I worked in hip hop from '94 up until now. Being a collector, I collected all the flyers of all the places that we went to. I took photographs. I collected the cassette tapes, CDs, albums. So I kept all that material. So by default, I have a huge collection of hip hop memorabilia in the Black History 101 Mobile Museum. So I just pulled that material out, thought about the contributions of hip hop through the lens of Michigan, the state of Michigan. So in the state of Michigan, you have Flint, you have people like MC Breed that came out of Flint. Obviously Detroit, you have huge artists like Royce the 5'9", you have Awesome Dre, you have Nikki D, who's Kalima Johnson, you have Boss. So you know, hip hop in Michigan has made its contributions. You have Jay Dilla, who's a huge artist, who had a huge impact on hip hop culture. And so not only hip hop's influence coming from Michigan, but also hip hop coming into Michigan and that impact. So a lot of people wouldn't know the places, for example, where Tupac performed in Michigan. So we've been documenting that. So Tupac performed 3 or 4 times in Michigan. He performed in Flint, Michigan. He performed in East Lansing. He actually caught a case in East Lansing that we found out. He performed in Detroit as a solo artist, and he performed as a dancer for Digital Underground when they came through Detroit early on. So we're documenting that type of material as well. Nipsey Hussle came to Detroit and performed. And so we have documentation on that. We documented when Biggie came to Detroit, and the Pioneers, Run DMC, X-Clan, Public Enemy, documenting all that type of material as well. So this is a very, very unique archive for a college. And it's my first relationship collaboration with an institution. So the Black History 101 Mobile Museum is mobile, so I don't have a physical brick and mortar, but this archive is going to be a very valuable resource for scholars, for students, for the community who are interested in just learning more about Michigan and hip hop. And we're part of a small group of maybe a handful of colleges on the national level that actually have hip hop archives. So Cornell University has the largest hip hop archive in the world, but Harvard University has an archive. William and Mary College has an archive as well. The University of Houston has one, and there's several more that have them. But we're honored to be among other universities who have made a commitment to have hip hop archives. And this is a way to really motivate students and affirm students who are part of this culture. There's many, many students from a very diverse group, global group of background of folks that have been impacted by hip hop culture. And it's a great affirmation to our identity as young folks.
So Doc, tell me, in your opinion, what is the state of hip hop? I get so many perspectives about it's gone downhill, it's too black. As a scholar, as a participant, as now a curator moving forward, what's your sense? How do you talk about the state of hip hop today?
It depends upon point of reference. If your introduction to hip hop culture is coming strictly through the radio, television, and YouTube, you might have a very and if you're over 50 and you're listening to your youngsters listening to that through that lens, then you might have a very negative opinion about hip hop culture. But if you're a part of the culture and you're you're participating in the culture in different locales throughout the globe, you can go and put your finger on hip hop culture in Uganda, for example, and see how rich it is, and see how a country like Uganda, based upon their cultural norms, have taken hip hop, whether or not it's the element of hip hop that's visual arts, that's graffiti, or whether or not it's dance, which is one of the elements of hip hop, or whether it's DJing or emceeing, and see how people put their own flavor on it. And then when you add the fifth element of hip hop culture, which is the knowledge of self, and to see what you can do in terms of social justice and how it speaks to injustice on where you're at in the world. So when I think about hip hop in the Middle East, for example, when the Arab Spring happened several years ago, and how hip hop was leading in terms of the voice of the people in that area, and how people responded to that. Or when we think about hip hop here in America, in the power of it to speak to some of the injustices that's happening in America. When I think about hip hop activists such as Jasiri X, for example, or Immortal Technique, you know what I'm saying? They're not only performers of hip hop, but they're using that platform of hip hop to make change, right? I talked about mentorship earlier. The program that Jasiri X has and Paradise Gray have out of Pittsburgh, One Hood, and the work that they're doing with the young folks to show them the power of the media and how you can create media to make change and to use your voice to amplify your voice. All right, put a camera or film camera and give that to a young person, and have them go out and document their experiences and share that with the world. That's the power of hip hop. But if you're listening to, some of these mumble rappers all day, every day, and that's your only introduction to hip hop, that's kind of problematic. Or when you listen to hip hop that promotes only violence and misogyny and drug use, that's a problem.
Yeah.
So, and we have to educate people on how to listen to hip hop with a critical eye. So if I'm working with young folks in a K through 12 situation, I'm going to acknowledge the folks that they're listening to, right? We're going to acknowledge them, but we're going to ask them critical questions about what you're listening to, right? And just that acknowledgement to young folks that you're listening to what they're listening to, and that you're hip to the culture, the language, the imagery, and you acknowledge how that culture impacts them. That's huge for a teacher.
Yeah.
That's huge, right? And that's your way into their world. But once you get into that world, as an educator, you want to take them from the point of where they are and take them where you want them to go.
Yeah.
And that's a very powerful way to teach and engage students. So that's one of the, that's one of the things that I try to do with young folks that I work with. And that's the point of reference. Any exhibit that you go, you are exposed to with the Black History 101 Mobile Museum, you'll see elements of hip hop in it, because we have to capture young folks where they are. So my latest exhibit was hip hop based, and so the students walked through and they saw Nicki Minaj and Cardi B represented in the exhibit. But it wasn't just Cardi B and Nicki Minaj, right? It was them next to Queen Latifah, Sha Rock, MC Lyte, Lauryn Hill. So you get a balance. So you bring them into a deeper conversation about the contributions of Black women to hip hop culture.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Doc, I could ask you like 25 more, but we're running short on time. But I do want to ask you about power, money, hip hop, because there's also some conversation about who controls hip hop, particularly as it relates to white cultural dominance, capitalism, white males particularly, and how that has, I think, been a part of the original, possibly commercial production. But
Right.
what's your sense of the power of hip hop today? Has that changed? Are the rappers in more control? What's your sense in reference to hip hop power capital?
I would say that the opportunity for young folks to become entrepreneurs in hip hop culture is 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 infinite. There's many. When we think about hip hop, a lot of people think just rappers, right? But one of the things that the Michigan Hip Hop Archive will show, just through the material that we've collected and the things that have come through in terms of donations, when we look at all the CDs and albums that were created in Michigan, these were all created mainly by Black entrepreneurs, Black men and women who invested their money into creating these record labels, for example, or those graphic design artists who created businesses to design these albums, to become photographers and take these press photos and that sort of thing, or those hip hop journalists who were writers who created their own PR companies as well. So in that respect, hip hop created so many avenues for entrepreneurs in terms of fashion. I even talk about fashion, but fashion and all of those things. Now, the corporatization of hip hop culture. When the corporations saw that there was an opportunity to make money from hip hop culture, that's when you saw the extreme exploitation of the culture. All right. So when you had the golden era of hip hop and that Black consciousness movement going on, one of the problematic things that I say often is that when you had groups like Public Enemy, KRS-One demanding that artists and questioning whether or not artists should be in control of their masters, for example, that had record companies scared, right? Like these young folks are asking for ownership now. And they're like, oh, we can't have that, right? So at the same time that that's going on, you see this switch of this Black consciousness movement, Afrocentric movement, to in the early 90s, the switch to gangster rap, right? And if white record companies don't have to be challenged by gangster rappers, players, pimps, because they all about money. Cut me a check and I'll dance for you, right? I'll rap for you. They're not asking critical questions anymore. And so they start cutting them, they cut those boys checks. And they're happy to have money. So they're not complaining. They're not pushing, they're not pushing back.
Yeah.
But then you have a Tupac, then you have a Nipsey Hussle, then you have a Kendrick Lamar, right? Then you have my young man from Chicago,
Chance
the Rapper. I'm not signing to nobody, right? But I'll leave it at this. In the past year or two, the facade, and I would say even the facade of hip hop's first billionaires, in terms of Jay-Z and most recently Kanye West, which those brothers are giving their accolades, and they are billionaires, which is a beautiful thing. But after 40 years of hip hop culture, first we have to say that they're not hip hop's first billionaires. Billionaires have been in hip hop for a long time. They just ain't been hip hop, right? They ain't been hip hop. And for us to say that after 40 years that we only could put our fingers on 2 billionaires in hip hop, that's a damn shame.
Yeah.
That tells you what the exploitation is of hip hop culture. We have to demand more. Yeah. As a culture, we have to demand more. So 2 billionaires after 40 years, that's unacceptable. Yeah. Unacceptable. Yeah. Follow the money. There's folks cutting Jay-Z and Kanye West checks. Who's cutting their checks? Right? It's just like us, celebrating athletes. It's great to say that, LeBron James makes so many $100 million, but somebody's cutting him a check. The owners. After all these years that the NBA has been around, and all the black players that have sacrificed their lives and played basketball, football, baseball, no black owners in the NBA, no black owners in the NFL, and these fools get mad because Colin Kaepernick wants to take a knee. Come on, we have to push back.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's a lot.
You just opened up another part too. I got to get you back.
Yes, sir.
I got to get you back. I want to give you a chance to participate in my lightning round, which are just things I put out there, and I ask people to just give me their thought, 15, 30 seconds or so. Okay. So first thing is code switching.
It's necessary. You gotta do it.
Entrepreneurship.
On your own, do for self.
Facebook.
It's a tool. Use it as a weapon.
Tupac or Biggie?
Tupac.
Cardi B or Nicki Minaj? Who you rolling with?
Cardi B.
Sir Mix-a-Lot or Macklemore? Who you rolling with?
I got a funny Macklemore story. Macklemore.
Eminem or Lil Wayne? Who you rolling with?
I'm a Detroit. I gotta say M.
Tina Turner or Whitney?
You said Tina Turner or Whitney?
Yeah.
Ooh, you hurt me right there. Tina Turner.
How about Beyonce or Janet Jackson?
Janet Jackson.
Taylor Swift or Lady Gaga?
Neither one.
Hey, Doc, you going with The Wire or you going with New Jack City?
Ooh, The Wire. The Wire.
If you got to do a lip sync competition, what's the song you going to call on? What's your lip sync go-to?
Just my imagination.
All right, I'm going to give you one last one because this is the talk of the town now. You going with Bron, Jordan, or Kobe?
Bron.
Man, I tell you, Doc, I appreciate that. Listen, we've been asking people to contribute to our what to watch, what to listen to, what to read list during quarantine. Folks have found themselves doing a little extra of some of those things. Is there anything you've discovered or anything you would recommend for our, here's what you should watch, here's what you should read, here's what you should listen to during quarantine? What's something you could add to our list?
Wow. I've been reading Stamp from the beginning. Kendry Ibram's book. Ibram Kendi's book. And I had started some months back, but it had been traveling so much I couldn't get into it. But that's something I've been reading lately. But you know what? I'm encouraging people when they can to just get out into nature, man. Just to get out and experience nature. We're spending a lot of time in front of screens right now, and we have to get beyond the screen. We have to get back in touch with ourselves. And I think part of that is just getting out and taking a walk through the woods, man, and getting by a lake or a river, and just reflecting on nature, man. So that's my big thing.
Well, listen, Doc, I appreciate you spending some time with us. I appreciate you supporting me since the time we met.
Yes, sir.
Being part
I'm
of
honored to be here, bro.
being a part of the WPC, and I want you to know, as long as you're moving forward, if there's anything we can do to partner with you, collaborate with you, as long as we have a party, you're invited to the party.
Man, thank you very much. I am honored, brother, and I want to salute you for everything that you've been doing for over the years, man. I think this is my first time not seeing you in a suit and tie, bro.
Well, it's Lion King Day here at the house, so we just trying to keep the spirits high, man.
If I wasn't celebrating Ramadan right now, I'll be drinking some coffee with you, bro. So, hey, man.
Bro, much love to you, man.
Thank you very much.
You take care of yourself, bro.
You too, brother. Good seeing you.
All right.
Thank you.
Peace.
All right, peace.